Hi there, this is a short video on the history of public housing in inner Sydney. So the very first public housing built in Sydney was in the Rocks Millers Point area. In around 1900, the bubonic plague spread through the area and the government bought up a lot of the housing in the Rocks and Millers Point and turned it into worker housing for many of the workers on the docks there and the piers. Gradually, with that sort of public housing there, it was from existing housing, private housing stock, but eventually they built their own dedicated housing, and this is probably the most famous example there, the housing on High Street, Millers Point, and that's one of the long-standing residents there, Barney Gardner, who was born there, and sadly, in around about 2015, under the coalition state government, they wanted to sell all of that, and they did. They finished selling all of that, just about all the public housing in Millers Point in the Rocks around about 2017 after a strong campaign to stop it. Also, a little bit later on, this is 1912. Roland Dacey in the state government recognised the need for public housing, and they started plans on the Dacey Garden suburb, or Daceyville, not far from Kingsford in Sydney's eastern suburbs, and it was designed along a sort of a garden estate principles. These were low-rise separated homes, and it didn't really ever become to the scale that they envisioned, but it was completed in 1920 with about 300 homes. Now, while the state government was constructing Daceyville, the city of Sydney started building its own public housing. And this Strickland building in Chippendale was completed in 1914 and is the first example of council-built public housing in Australia. It has about 71 apartments with shops underneath. Another building from this time was Ways Terrace in Piermont. It still is public housing. It was built in 1925. A little bit after that, this was also built by the City of Sydney, just showing that councils can or historically have built public housing. This is the Alexandra Dwellings in Camperdown, built in 1927. And this is, in fact, the childhood home of Anthony Albanese, the Prime Minister of Australia. It's still there, it's still public housing. Now, around the Depression, I'm talking about the 1930s, a lot of low-income people were being evicted from their homes because they weren't able to afford the rent. And there was a large movement called the Unemployed Workers Movement. It was started by members of the Communist Party, but extended deeply into the layers of the trade union movement and local residents. And they would go around and find hear about people that were being evicted and help them occupy their homes to prevent the evictions. And this reached ahead in 1931 in Union Street, Erskineville. 27 people were badly injured. One was shot. The bystander was killed. And that put a lot of pressure on Jack Lang, the Labor State Premier at the time, to do something about housing. The rules slightly changed so that landlords had to give a slightly longer notice period for evictions. A little bit later, this is 1938, very close to where that eviction battle happened. In Union Street, a lovely public housing estate was built in the eastern part of Erskineville, called Erskineville Estate, and that is still public housing today. And in around 2002, the Labor state government wanted to demolish it and privatise most of it. And this guy, Hal Alexander, great activist, long-term member of the Communist Party, joined with Jack Carnegie, one of the founding members of the Greens, and together with the Strong Community Campaign, they saved that public housing, and it's still there today. There's a good documentary about that called Saving Erko Estate. It's on YouTube. During the war, well, not a lot was built, but post-war, of course, there was post-war reconstruction. And at around this time, 18% of housing built in Australia was public housing. In fact, if we had kept up at the rate of public housing build, we would be have a similar public housing level to many Northern European countries. But we never really kept up that pace of public housing building. Um, After Menzies came to power, the pace slowed down, and also a lot of it was sold to the tenants and became private housing. Yeah, and this is a good example of the housing in the inner Sydney area from that period. This is the Greenway building from 1954. It has a bit over 300 homes in there. Um, yeah, unfortunately, in 2019, this was management of this building was transferred um, from the state government responsibility to St George Housing under the Social Housing Management Transfer uh, program, whereby public housing convert was converted to privatised to social housing, and the management taken care of by private community housing providers. Housing CEOs, their average salary is in the order of $350,000 a year. So a lot of the people living in these places are paying for those exorbitant salaries instead of public servants who work in a place like the Housing Commission, who obviously earn a lot less money. And many of those people, hundreds of employees in those in the Housing Commission, have been laid off um, in this process of privatisation. Another building from that period, yeah, is the Northcote building in 19 was built in 1963. That's in Surrey Hills, and in the post-war period, the area of Sydney which got the most uh, public housing was Waterloo. And this is an example of the housing from that period. This is a 1948 three-story walk-up close to Raglan Street, and it's still there today. It has been refurbished with those external balconies that you can see, and it's quite a nice estate. Unfortunately, though, that is planned for demolition under the current and privatisation under the current Labor state government. Now, a lot of these inner city areas in the post-war period, with suburbanisation, suburbs like Waterloo, Erskineville, Alexandria, Piermont, Woolloomooloo, Surrey Hills, and Redfern, became the most considered the most undesirable suburbs in Sydney. And yeah, the ranking of Waterloo was 363rd out of 367 suburbs in Sydney. And so a lot of public housing was built in these areas to replace the existing terrace housing, because it was considered slums. The people who live there didn't consider it to be slums though, and a lot of low income tenants were living in areas like Waterloo, and some even managed to buy their own homes in these dilapidated areas like Waterloo. Now, the pace of that of the purchase by the state government and construction was very rapid, and um, reached kind of a crescendo in the early 70s. But this also coincided with the growing resident action movements and the green bans of the Builders Labourers Federation. People like Jack Mundy, Bob Pringle, and Joe Owens led the Green Bands movement, and it was around this stage in Waterloo with this Endeavour project going up, which had four large slab buildings and two 30-story towers. There you can see Matavai and Taranga. Um, that a lot of the local residents weren't being consulted, and they just they supported public housing, but they wanted to say in the development. A lot of them were being pushed out of forced to sell their homes at only half their market value, and were never able to live in the city again. So they started to rise up. The South Sydney Resident Action Group and Marge Barry. You can watch more about that in the documentary called Waterloo by Tom Zubrycki. Yeah, they started to resist, and the Builders Labourers Federation supported them. In 1972, the state government gazetted the whole of the eastern Waterloo area and said that those 500 terrace homes would be demolished and replaced by six 30-story towers, similar to Matavai and Taranga, which you see there. Then the residents got active, and the BLF put a green ban on that demolition until the residents were properly consulted about the development. And in December 1973, Tom Zubrycki, the federal Labor Minister for Urban Development, urged New South Wales, the Askin state government, to stop that demolition because at around this time, the philosophy of very large apartment towers was starting to fall apart. There were very high rates of suicide being reported from buildings like this in other countries, and people felt dislocated from their neighbourhood being high up in those towers, and there was a different philosophy coming about where with the green bands, as I mentioned, to take existing low rent housing in the inner city and buy it up in whole for the purpose of making public housing. And that's what the Whitlam government did in places like Woolloomooloo and in Glebe, in Glebe, where they were planning on putting huge expressways through. So the anti-expressway movement coincided with the resident action movement for and demands for to retain low-income housing, and a green ban was put on Woolloomooloo and two different parts of Glebe, and eventually the federal government of Gough Whitlam bought those lands. In this case, in Glebe, it was off the Anglican church, and made that into public housing. So in Glebe, there were 600 homes that became public homes, and in Woolloomooloo, there were 200. And as a result of those green bands fights, one of the bigger victories, the construction of the Sirius building in 1980, and that was a direct result of the Rocks Resident Action Group and the BLF green bands demanding public housing. So a few homes were demolished in the Rocks, but the Sirius building was built to house those people who would have otherwise had to move out of the area. Now, a similar kind of thing happened in Waterloo. This is a photo from around about 1975 in Raglan Street, when the South Sydney Resident Action Group, led by people like Marge Barry, barricaded themselves into a house and demanded that it not be demolished. And eventually, with the Neville Wran Labor government coming to power in 1976, they abandoned the plan for those 6 towers and that whole eastern part of Waterloo, going up to Elizabeth Street, low-rise terrace public housing. And as a further result, a few very much more modern design, attractive public housing buildings were built in Waterloo. This one is Drysdale. Another next to it is called Dobell, and that was also designed by the same architect who designed the Sirius building. That was Tao Gophers. Unfortunately, though, the state government wants to demolish this building as well. Moving forward into like the 2010s, the Liberal state government from 2011 to 2023, we're talking Mike Baird, Perrottet and Berejiklian, they sold over 3 billion of public and community housing. And so that's a huge loss in the amount of proportion of public housing in Sydney. And Australia's proportion of public housing has declined to 3.8%. As you can see on this graph, that puts us well behind the similar, wealthy countries of Western Europe. And for a while there, remember that Australia was building 18% of new housing was public housing. If we'd continued that way, we would be up at the levels of places like Scotland and Denmark and Sweden. Another privatisation process that has been going on is the transfer of the management and operation of public housing to community housing providers. And as of 2023, that figure, that orange part of the bar has grown to about 30% of all public housing being shifted to community housing providers, and the loss of jobs in the public housing sector as well. So the struggle goes on today. Even the current Labor state government, despite their promises, is continuing to demolish and privatise existing public housing. This is 82 Wentworth Park Road, Glebe, which the demolition there is imminent, and there are campaigners, especially us in Action for Public Housing, trying to stop that demolition from proceeding. We believe that renovation and retrofitting, infilling these buildings, along with all the experts, I believe that too, is a much better option. They similarly want to do this in South Everleigh. Want to demolish only 30-year-old homes in South Everleigh. And of course, in Waterloo, the first stage of that is the Waterloo South, where there are 750 public homes. They want to demolish all of those and build 70% private housing. So it's a long and turbulent history, but really the only way that we can improve housing affordability in Australia is by a large-scale build of public housing, and also with rent controls on private housing. And if you care about this, you want to get involved, please join Action for Public Housing. Thank you.